Imagine being able to scan every newspaper and social media feed each and every day to find out what the people of Ontario are talking about during the provincial election campaign. Well, the artificial intelligence known as Polly does exactly that. And with us tonight from London, UK, is Erin Kelly, President and CEO of Advanced Symbolics Inc, who makes the data that Polly collects intelligible to the rest of us. Erin, it's good to see you, and I guess we should remind everybody that you're going to be with us on a regular basis every week during the course of this 43rd general election campaign. So let's just start at the beginning. What's the state of play as we sit here talking tonight?
The state of play tonight is Doug Ford is in a comfortable first-place position. Polly sees him winning 75 seats today, with the NDP. Interestingly enough, the NDP is in second place. The Liberals are in third place. But here's what's really interesting. We have twice as many people talking about Stephen Del Duca as we do Andrea Horwath. So Andrea's numbers are going down a little bit, while Stephen Del Duca is going up. Is
there much undecided vote to speak of?
Not really. There doesn't appear to be undecided. Now, where there is undecided, I would say for Mr. Ford, those voters appear to be pretty solid right now. Where there is indecision is in that NDP Liberal competition.
And if you look at, say, the past, 3 to 6 months, in the lead up to the campaign, does any party appear to have any momentum drawn from that period of time that they can bring to the campaign today?
Ah, that's a tough one. Well, what Doug Ford is drawing on in terms of his momentum, he got a lot of momentum out of the budget, but of course that was quite recent. I would say Andrea Horwath was drawing momentum up until about the beginning of 2022. When Doug Ford was going through a difficult time during COVID, when people felt that there wasn't the investment made in hospitals, et cetera. But she lost quite a bit of momentum during the trucker protest when she wasn't seen. She didn't say anything. Doug Ford got some lift out of that by calling the state of emergency. And Stephen Del Duca, that's when he starts to become known, because he came to Ottawa and he has been speaking out quite a bit since the beginning of this year about how to come out of the pandemic, et cetera. So I'd say Andrea Horwath has lost some momentum. The other two seem to be, well, Stephen Del Duca is gaining momentum and Doug Ford is just kind of cruising along. He was losing momentum during COVID, but he has gained back some momentum now with the budget and also with how he behaved during the trucker protest, interestingly enough to me.
Now, that's the data, but of course, we're always looking for explanations behind the data, and I'm going to throw one out here, and you tell me if this makes any sense. Obviously, the Premier's been around for 4 years in the big job. People know him. Andrea Horwath has been around for quite a while. This is her 4th general election as NDP leader, so more people know her. Maybe more people are talking online about Stephen Del Duca because he's the new guy in this contest and they're trying to figure out who he is. Is that reasonable?
Actually, what we're seeing is the reason people are talking about Stephen Del Duca is because of, number one thing they're talking about him about is the buck a ride, bringing down the cost of transit. It seems to have caught on as a meme, if you will, and we see a lot of people talking about that. Andrea Horwath, her policies are, lowering income taxes for lower and middle income people. We're seeing that seems to be a complicated policy that it's not easy to talk about, so we're not seeing people talk about it. So in fact, twice as many people are talking about Stephen Del Duca, 12.5% of all discussions about politicians are about him versus only 7% about Andrea Horwath and her policies. So really it is policies. She's not grabbing people with her policies so far.
I guess I would say parenthetically, they've both made big, expensive promises, Del Duca and Horwath, as it relates to public transit. Del Duca's is catchier, I think. Buck a ride is very simple to understand versus the NDP's, we will subsidize half the operating costs of municipal transit systems all across the province. Not quite as grabby, although it may be, who knows, more effective in the long run. Any evidence that you've picked up so far, Erin, that the Greens can win more than one seat this time out?
We're not seeing it so far. No, we're seeing exactly one seat.
So Mike Schreiner keeps his seat at the moment?
At the moment. So, we're very, very early days. But at the moment, just one seat.
I'm glad you said that, because my next line was going to be reminding everybody that polls are an excellent indication of what people thought yesterday. They don't tell you what people are going to do 28 days from now. So we put that on the record as a good reminder to everybody of the fact that we're a long way from the finish line here. All right, that's the leaders. How about the issues? What are the main things people are talking about right now?
Number one thing is affordability. So anything to do with affordability, but you have to keep it really easy to understand. You know, I'm going to reduce the cost of housing. Daycare is very hot and interesting. Inflation generally, but not so much inflation as what specifically are you going to do that's easy, that I can tell my friends that you're going to do this. You know, as we said earlier about Andrea Horwath, her policies are just too complicated, need to get it really simplified. But affordability is by far the number one thing. Also of interest, if I look at some issues in education, that one's complex. We have some people who want to see more innovation in education. We also have a lot of middle to lower income people very concerned about things they've heard that Doug Ford was going to make changes to OSAP. And they're very, very concerned about that. And that is a vote costing issue. We actually see people switching their vote over that. And so just affordability issues in general, I would say, is by far the main issue. And of course, in that sense, Doug Ford's license plate refunds and saying he's going to get rid of that expense has really, really, we're seeing a lot of people talk about that. So simple, bite-sized ways to save the taxpayer money, that's a winner in this election.
I wonder, though, Erin, whether anybody looks at the promises that will be emerging over the next few weeks' time, and whether they say cost of housing, nobody can do a damn thing about that. Inflation, nobody can do a damn thing about that. I mean, I appreciate that they're making promises, but are these promises landing with any credibility with the electorate that you can pick up?
Good point. With inflation, not as much. And that's why I said don't emphasize that too much, because a lot of people feel that premiers can't really affect inflation. For housing, they do feel that the premiers and the leaders have a role to play here. People understand that municipalities, there's a feeling that municipalities have to approve more housing sites, have to do more, and that the province has power over municipalities, and so they can make that change. There is concern of who's going to build these houses. I mean, we can't find people to work anywhere right now. So there's definitely maybe we have to rethink the types of people that we bring to Canada, maybe less of the nuclear physicists and more of the people with hammers who build houses and do those jobs. Because I think for a long time, we've just been bringing in the same kind of new Canadians, and maybe a lot of people talking about we need to change that.
And what is Polly picking up in terms of which segment of the electorate would be most fiercely interested in the housing issue right now?
All of them.
Everybody.
No, it really is everybody. I mean, even people who own a house are worried about their children. We see grandparents talking about their grandchildren. And of course, the young people themselves, people 18 to 25, and older into their 30s. But 18 to 25 is the group that often doesn't vote. Well, they might vote now because they're concerned not just about housing, but rent. I mean, just cost of living. I mean, am I going to be living with my parents forever?
This is what people who are in politics say. More men are interested in what the Conservatives have to say. Liberals and New Democrats, who tend to focus more on social services, have a greater appeal to the female part of the electorate. Does Polly pick up that break as well?
She does. There's definitely more. We still see men are more interested, are more likely to vote Conservative than NDP, for sure.
And what about on the issue of, say, healthcare and education? Does any one party seem to have a clear advantage over another on those kinds of issues? Interestingly,
Doug Ford, because I think he's been talking about it more. So, you know, you might not like Doug Ford, what he's saying about education, but the other two aren't saying anything, so there's no alternative there. And the people who do want to see changes in education are then more likely to vote for Doug Ford. So it's definitely a hot topic. And I think that the other leaders need to address it. They need to address what they would do in education And I think saying we're going to keep the status quo is probably not a good campaign strategy right now. There's a lot of people talking about it, and I'd say there's not enough different options there.
Well, this is why I'm glad we're going to be seeing you every week, because Stephen Del Duca this morning made an announcement about education in which he pledged to take the money that he's not going to need because he wouldn't build Highway 413 and take that $10 billion and put it into, I think it was building 200 new schools and upgrading or renovating 4,500 others. So I'll be interested to hear what Paulie has to say about that next week. What about, nobody seems to want to talk about COVID-19 anymore, and it hasn't gone away, actually. We've still got lots of people in hospital dealing with COVID-19, but none of the parties has really spoken about it yet at all. Is Paulie picking up any conversation among the electorate on that front?
Yes. So it's really interesting. We looked at how people felt about politicians when we entered COVID and how they feel about politicians now. And people were a lot happier with politicians when we entered COVID. We're seeing that people felt that politicians did the right thing during COVID, shutting everybody down, giving CERB, all of that. But they don't feel we're doing the right things coming out of COVID. So either because we're coming out too quickly, that's what some people feel. Other people feel we're not coming out quickly enough. Other countries are out, they're doing things. Our economy is going to fall behind. And there's chaos, obviously, at this right now. I mean, some of it because of COVID, but some of it outside of that. So there's definitely a feeling that things are out of control and that the politicians need to do more to get a handle and steer us out of COVID the same way that they steered us into it.
And yet, you don't hear any of the politicians talking about it right now. It's almost as if they want to leave it in the rearview mirror and talk about anything except COVID-19. Any theories on that?
Yeah, and the population wants them to talk about it, first of all. And I think the reason they're not probably is because it causes fights between the parties, right? It becomes a wedge issue. But we need to find a way to talk about it so that the population feels it's being addressed. There's a plan. Here's the problem. Like, in Pennsylvania, for example, when they brought back the mask mandate, everybody knew what the rule was for bringing back masks. 50 people in hospital, mask mandate comes back. People are saying, we see a lot of people saying online, what is the plan here? When do we bring back mask mandates? We keep being told it might happen, but what's the metric for that? What will success look like? How many people in the hospital before we start to say this is over? Like, what are the deciding metrics that people should be looking for? And that guidance isn't there. Just saying that, even something neutral like that, I think would go a long way to having people feel that there's a plan, and because trust is very low right now.
Interesting. Let me focus on the Premier for a moment here, because, of course, I think the first question everybody asks themselves at election time is, do we want these guys back? And if they do want them back, then it's going to be a pretty uninteresting campaign. And if they don't want them back, then you got to fight for who replaces them. So on the issue of Doug Ford, he's obviously a very polarizing figure. A lot of people love him. A lot of people can't stand him. Why? I put this question to progressive people all the time. If he's so hated by so many people and you guys don't get him, why is he in first place? Is there an answer for that?
Why he's in first place?
Yeah.
Generally speaking, we find that maybe the ones who dislike him are balanced out by the ones who like him, and maybe, the other two parties, Andrea Horwath is not winning hearts and minds. But we definitely see him. He's in solid first place. He's not fighting for his job at this point. So it's definitely his to lose. And we're not seeing the vitriol against him that you might be led to believe through mainstream media. I hate to use that term, but.
No, I get you. At this point, and again, we're early in the campaign here, very early. I mean, this is day one, for goodness sakes. Early in the campaign, do you see the makings of any kind of dynamism in the electorate right now, which suggests they might be open to a different argument or persuaded to go a different way for whatever reason over the next month?
Well, it's interesting. We do have a category right now that we opened this year called vote switchers. So these are people so we've got people all categorized. These people voted PC in the last election. How many of those people are thinking of switching? Same thing for Liberals and NDP. So that would be a good thing to follow up on next week. And because it's early days right now, we do see some people being interested in what Stephen Del Duca has to offer, so they might switch their vote. Right now, we're seeing a lot of the vote switching conversation between NDP and Liberals. So that's definitely something that we will be tracking through this election.
Now, that makes sense because the NDP and the Liberal and the Greens, for that matter, are all sort of trying to be the champions of the progressive side of the political spectrum. But are there, well, maybe it's too early to ask this question, but I'll try anyway. Are there vote switchers that you would see between Liberals and Conservatives, or even, say, between New Democrats and Conservatives?
We're not seeing that right now. So early days, but right now it looks like Ford Nation has a pretty solid following. And the fight is between the NDP and the Liberals. And the strategy here for Horwath has to be to not let people remember Stephen Del Duca and put her fight against Doug Ford. Gotcha.
And again, last question, just so I'm clear, is there any suggestion at this stage of the game that there is enough of an undecided segment of the electorate that it could affect what seems to be the prevailing narrative that all pollsters are saying right now, which is this is Ford's to lose?
We're not seeing anything, any kind of monster coming up to bite Doug Ford right now. So I might reveal, you can play that back for me as we get closer, but right now, no, we've been looking for what's the gotcha. And so far it's pretty smooth.
But that's why we stay tuned, because you just never know what's coming around the corner.
Exactly. It's early days.
Right on. Erin, as always, thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you again next week.
Great. Thanks, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.